saying
Timur.
Timur's paper.
Oops, I have to get this set up.
Do you have any paper that I can borrow? Oh, you want to write on something? Oh, okay. You can take that. I have this.
Are they in here? Nope. Sorry, where are they?
So Maya, do you know where?
Yeah, sorry, you showed me before, and now I've forgotten. Oh, okay, I went to the conference. All right, go there. Ah, all right. Thank you. And one more piece of equipment.
Pointers.
Oh, the pointer.
Oh,
yeah, there you go.
Okay, so it's always a pleasure to read and comment on Timur's papers because they're so thought-provoking, and the current paper is no exception. So Timur's been pondering for a long time the issue of why the whole world isn't developed, and also in particular why the Islamic world is not developed. And in this paper, he rejects basically two forms of determinism: the materialist kind, that culture doesn't matter, that it's perfectly malleable, that it changes in accordance with the needs of the economy, and the culturalist view that culture is everything, and that certain cultures are incompatible with modern economic development, that culture is fate. And the purpose of his paper is to lay out a middle ground, what he calls the systemic approach. And here's a quote for the paper, where he really is treating civilizations as living organisms that form systems of complementary variables that make it very difficult to manage change and so on. Well, I think there's much that is appealing in this approach. But I'm going to suggest that, like Tocqueville and Weber, that Timur is a little bit too close to the culturalist position, or too close to the big C view of civilizations in this paper. So just to give you a quick outline of my comment, I'm going to make that case, first of all, that he's a little too big C civilization in this paper, and then offer an alternative systemic approach that is too much the opposite direction, too materialist. And then I'm going to muse about how we might synthesize these two positions and maybe even test their relative explanatory power. And I'm going to try to make this first point really quickly by referring to the Timur's critique of Maxime Rodinson's Islam and Civilization. Rodinson, as Timur said a moment ago, argued that the prohibition against charging interest was of little practical significance because it was easily evaded. And Timur says, yes, that's true, but the methods used to evade the prohibition of interest also had costs. They raised transactions costs. Moreover, they resulted in a lack of transparency in financial transactions that prevented lots of things from happening, and in particular prevented the development of sophisticated accounting techniques that were critical, Timur suggests, for capitalist development. Now, what I think goes on in this example and a couple other examples in the paper is that there's always a standard against which Islamic commercial practices are compared and found wanting. And that standard is, I think, an idealized version of Western civilization, which is that big C civilization that Richard was talking about before. And I say idealized because I actually think the practical reality of Western civilization is very different. And so I'll just draw really quickly on some of my own work on the 19th century United States, or not my own work, but my area of expertise, the 19th century United States. Of course, there was no prohibition on interest in the 19th century United States, but there was a usury ceiling. And it was a binding usury ceiling, and you find people using all kinds of stratagems in the 19th century to evade the usury ceiling. This is an economy that's developing very rapidly. This is additional transaction costs, but they clearly are not keeping this economy from developing. There's a very nice paper by Ephraim Ben Melech on interest, usury ceiling, and the binding nature of it in the 19th century. The other thing I'd say very quickly, again from what I know about the 19th century, is while it's true that Western society had the benefit of sophisticated bookkeeping models, business people often didn't use them. And most industrialists I've looked at in the 19th century kept very poor records and didn't even know things like what their costs were or whether they were making a profit, and tended to use rule of thumb methods, just as you might expect earlier economic actors to have done. Okay, so that's very quick. Now very quickly, my alternative to materialist systemic approach. This is from a literature called The Big Push, okay, and so there's some citation down at the bottom, but basically what this literature suggests is that that sometimes when you industrialize, it may be that the domestic market is so small that if one business industrializes, it's not going to earn any profits. And so what you really need is coordinated industrialization of many sectors at the same time. You need a concerted, simultaneous industrialization, can be self-sustaining, even if no sector alone could have broken even industrializing. So we have two versions of the coordination problem: the optimistic view, which is the big push that maybe government, for example, could step in and provide this coordinated industrialization that would allow this to go on in multiple sectors. Then I think you have the pessimistic view, which is Timur's, which is reforming a civilization involves targeting a cluster of variables all at once, and he emphasizes in this paper the enormity of the tasks. So very quickly, just coordinate. I want to suggest that perhaps we could put these two pessimistic and optimistic views together by suggesting that maybe over time, coordinating industrialization through the big push has become more important because we have more increasing return technologies that are hard for businesses to profit from alone. You need a coordinated industrialization. And we might also hypothesize that entrepreneurial activity that occurs simultaneously across many sectors is more likely to lead to broad cultural change than activity that occurs in only one sector. So therefore, we could maybe speculate that cultural practices were likely to be more binding during the early period of industrialization, when you're only going perhaps part of the economy and not the whole economy. But in a place where there's a big push, they may be more likely to give way. And so then I would argue, just to finish up back to the history, that the historical record is roughly consistent with this kind of synthesis, that early industrialization was confined to areas with institutions that were generally thought to be conducive to, that we think today the big C civilization were conducive to economic development. But the big push industrialization in the late 20th century, think South Korea, for example, has transformed cultural practices as well as the economy. And then I would just say that we need to test these things more systematically. We need to actually look for places where entrepreneurial or economic activity is bumping up against constraints. And I just, as I walk away from this before I get the hook, I just say that I can actually give you lots of examples of in the U.S. where you bump up against things. And I think that these things can, in fact, be found. Okay.
Thank you, Naomi.